In the late 1800s, moving lumber out of the mountains was a losing battle, as timber bosses watched profits bleed away while horses and oxen crawled along muddy makeshift tracks. Trains could not survive the sharp bends and brutal grades, and engineers dismissed every proposed solution as foolish or impossible. Yet just as the industry neared collapse, an outsider's so-called clumsy invention promised a way out. Why did experts laugh right up until the machine rewrote the rules of mountain railroads? The answer starts in the midst of a full-blown economic crisis. Profits slipped through the fingers of lumber bosses every time the snow melted. In Michigan's pine country and the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the entire year's output hinged on a handful of winter weeks. Sled roads, packed and frozen, lined with teams of horses and oxen, became the only way to move timber from the woods to the mill. But as soon as spring arrived, those roads turned to mud, and log piles sat stranded until the next freeze. Camps that could cut 50 million board feet in a year often found themselves able to haul out only half that, no matter how many men they hired or how hard the animals worked. The numbers were brutal. A single horse team hauling logs a few miles to the river or railhead might manage 2 or 3 trips on a good day, maybe 6,000 board feet if the weather held. Multiply that by a dozen teams, and the daily total still paled beside the sawmill's appetite. Meanwhile, demand for lumber soared. Cities like Chicago, Milwaukee, and San Francisco were booming, and railroads needed endless ties and bridge timbers. Prices climbed, but so did the pressure. Every log left behind in the woods was lost money, and a warm winter could wipe out an entire season's profit. Hauling costs ate into margins. Sled teams and drivers had to be fed and housed all year, even though they worked at full pace for just 2 or 3 months. It cost $2 or $3 to move 1,000 board feet by sled, sometimes more in bad weather, while a logging railroad could promise the same job for less than $1. But building a proper railroad through the mountains or deep woods was out of reach for most outfits. Permanent track was expensive, and the terrain refused to cooperate. The result was a kind of quiet desperation. Sawmills built to run year-round sat idle for months, their ponds empty, while cash tied up in unsold timber gathered dust. Owners watched competitors with better access or luckier weather pull ahead. Some tried to lay cheap tramways or floated logs down rivers, but the risks and losses mounted. By the late 1870s, the old ways were failing. The numbers no longer added up. Something had to give, and the bosses, once content with tradition, found themselves willing to gamble on any idea, no matter how strange, if it could keep the mills running and the profits flowing. Standard steam locomotives, the workhorses of mainline railroads, were built for a world of straight rails and gentle slopes. Their power came from large pistons connected by side rods to a handful of driving wheels, all locked together in a rigid frame. On well-laid track, this system worked beautifully, speed and efficiency and a steady rhythm of churning steel. But when these same engines were put to work in the forests, everything changed. Logging railroads were a different beast, hastily constructed, laid over stumps and rocks, twisting through the woods wherever the timber stood. The rails were often light, the ties uneven, and the curves so sharp that a conventional locomotive could barely fit around them. The problem started with the wheelbase. Rod engines depended on a long, stiff frame to keep the driving wheels in line. This made every bump and dip in the track a potential disaster. On rough ground, the wheels would lose contact, shifting the locomotive's weight unevenly and putting enormous stress on the rails. Sharp curves forced those long frames to bind and twist, sometimes lifting wheels clear off the track. Derailments became a constant threat, not just a rare accident. Then came the hammer blow. The jarring force delivered every time a piston reached the end of its stroke. With each revolution, the side rods and counterweights sent a surge of vertical force down through the wheels, pounding the rails with every turn. On heavy, well-supported mainline track, this was manageable. On logging lines, it was a recipe for disaster. The light rails bent and shifted under the repeated blows, spikes worked loose, and the track itself began to spread apart. Sometimes the rails would simply give way, sending the engine into the mud or worse. Even when they stayed on the rails, these locomotives struggled for traction. Only a few wheels actually drove the train. So much of the engine's weight was wasted. On steep grades or slippery curves, the drivers spun helplessly or lost grip altogether. The pounding and slipping tore up the track faster than crews could repair it. And the cost of constant maintenance ate into any savings the railroad was supposed to provide. For engineers trained in the traditions of the main line, these failures seemed like the fault of the track, not the locomotive. But in the woods, the reality was clear. The very features that made rod engines fast and powerful on the open rails made them hopelessly unsuited for the crooked, makeshift world of logging lines. The industry needed a machine that could bend, grip, and crawl, something entirely different from the orthodox designs of the day. Ephraim Shay wasn't an engineer by training. He was a sawmill man, a merchant, a Civil War veteran, and above all, a problem solver. In the Michigan woods, he faced the daily reality of logs piling up while the means to move them failed. Instead of waiting for experts, he rolled up his sleeves and started tinkering. His workshop became a laboratory, cluttered with scraps of iron and wood. As he set out to build a locomotive that could do what the elegant, fast engines of the railroads could not. The first attempt was little more than a boiler and engine bolted to a flat car. Simple, but not enough. Shay watched how the log cars, riding on small, swiveling trucks, glided around curves that left rod locomotives derailed or broken. He wondered, what if the locomotive itself rode on the same kind of trucks? What if power could reach every axle, not just a few big drivers? He sketched and built, then rebuilt, learning by doing. He tried a chain drive first. Heavy chains ran from the engine down through the car floor to the axles. On paper, it made sense. In practice, the chains snapped, slipped, and tangled with every jolt and twist of the track. Next came a belt drive, leather bands looped around pulleys, meant to transfer power smoothly. But the belts stretched, slipped in the rain, and soon burned up under the strain of a loaded log train. Each failure sent him back to the drawing board, but each also taught him something new about what the locomotive had to endure. Shay wasn't aiming for speed or polish. He needed a machine that could crawl, grip, and survive punishment. He realized the answer lay in gears. By mounting vertical cylinders on one side of the engine and connecting them to a crankshaft, he could turn a line shaft running the length of the locomotive. Bevel gears at each axle would drive the wheels directly, just like the trucks under the log cars. This setup didn't care if the track was rough or the curves were sharp. It just kept turning, slow and steady. By the late 1870s, after seasons of trial and error, Shay had a working prototype. It looked odd, but it worked. The core mechanics were in place and the stage was set for something bigger. In 1881, Ephraim Shay took his odd-looking locomotive from workshop experiment to official invention. He filed for a United States patent, laying out every unconventional detail. Vertical cylinders perched on one side of the boiler, a crankshaft spinning beneath, and a line shaft running the length of the frame to power every axle through bevel gears. This was no minor tweak. To the established order of railroad engineering, it was heresy in cast iron. Locomotive men had spent decades perfecting the art of the rod engine, symmetrical, powerful, and built for speed. Shay's design, by contrast, looked like something cobbled together from spare parts and stubbornness. The boiler sat off-center to balance the weight of the side-mounted engine. The drive system snaked along the outside, exposed for every critic to see. Instead of the familiar chuff and glide of a mainline locomotive, the Shay moved with a steady, mechanical clatter, more factory floor than iron horse. The reaction from the professional class was swift and, for the most part, dismissive. In the trade press and among railroad men, the polite word was clumsy. Some called it a curiosity, a machine for loggers and miners who didn't know any better. The vertical cylinders and all-gear drive were seen as a step backwards, inefficient, slow, and needlessly complicated. Mainline engineers prided themselves on elegance and speed, and they looked at Shay's patent drawings and saw a violation of everything they held dear. Even Lima Machine Works, the company that would later build thousands of Shays, was at first unimpressed. It took persistent lobbying from Shay and his allies to convince them to take the risk. As Shay's patent moved through the system, the lack of enthusiasm was obvious. Major engineering journals largely ignored the invention, focusing their attention on ever-faster express locomotives and the latest advances in rod drive. The geared locomotive for logging roads barely registered, a backwoods solution for a backwoods problem. For Shay, the message was clear. The experts weren't just skeptical, they were certain the future belonged to their own kind of machine. If his locomotive was going to prove itself, it would have to do it on the rails, not on paper. The stage was set for a contest between practical results and professional pride. Conventional wisdom said a steam locomotive could not climb more than a gentle slope, and it certainly could not twist around a hairpin curve on rails laid over tree stumps and boulders. Shay's geared machine ignored every rule. Instead of chasing speed, it delivered raw, steady torque, power multiplied by gears, not wasted in a scramble for velocity. The secret was the line shaft running down the right side, spinning beneath the boiler. Every axle on every truck was driven by its own set of bevel gears, turning the entire locomotive into an all-wheel drive powerhouse decades before the term existed. While rod locomotives spun their wheels helplessly on anything steeper than 3%, Shay's creation crawled up slopes twice as steep, sometimes even more. Stories from Michigan logging camps told of the odd-looking engine hauling loaded log trains up grades as steep as 14%, a number that would have sounded like a misprint to a mainline engineer. Where others derailed on curves, the Shay seemed to relish them. Its trucks pivoted freely, letting the locomotive snake through bends as tight as 50 feet in radius. That is barely more than a city street corner, yet the Shay could pull a full load without complaint. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Suddenly, track that would have been written off as impossible became a viable route for timber. Loggers watched as the Shay powered through mud, snow, and tangled right-of-way, where even the lightest rod engines had failed. It did not matter that the machine looked awkward or moved with a mechanical clatter. What mattered was results. More logs moved, over tougher ground, in any season. The numbers spoke for themselves, and word began to spread through the woods. The first Lima-built Shay rolled out of the Ohio shop in 1880, bound for a Michigan logging railroad. It was no prototype or experiment. This was a machine ordered, paid for, and put to work. Word traveled fast through the timber camps. Loggers who had watched horses sink in spring mud and rod engines derail on crooked rails suddenly saw a locomotive that could climb hills, twist around hairpin curves, and keep moving when others quit. Within a year, more orders landed on Lima's desk. The first trickle became a steady stream. Each new delivery meant another camp running year-round, another sawmill pond full, another set of bosses with payrolls met and profits in the black. By the mid-1880s, Lima was building Shays by the dozen. Logging outfits from Michigan to West Virginia placed their bets on the oddball geared engine. Some ordered a single locomotive just to see if the stories were true. Others came back for a second or third, convinced by the results. The skeptics who once dismissed Shay's design watched as their own crews asked for a machine that could do the impossible. Reports from the woods spoke of loaded trains climbing grades that would have stopped a rod engine cold, and of loggers laying track wherever the timber stood, confident the Shay could follow. As the decade closed, the numbers told the story, with over 100 Shays at work and the order book still filling. What began as a backwoods gamble had become an industry standard. By the end of the production run in 1945, Lima had built more than 2,700 Shay locomotives, shipping them to every corner of the continent and beyond. The machine engineers once laughed at had become the backbone of mountain railroading. Shay locomotives did not stop at the edge of American forests. Their reputation for conquering impossible grades and twisted tracks spread quickly, drawing attention from far beyond the logging camps of Michigan and the Pacific Northwest. In the Andes, sugar plantations and mining companies ordered Shays to tackle railways that climbed thousands of feet through switchbacks and hairpin curves. These engines worked at altitudes where thin air sapped the power of conventional locomotives. Yet Shay's steady torque kept trains moving over slopes that would have brought other engines to a halt. Across the Pacific, timber and sugar railways in the Philippines faced monsoon floods, shifting ground, and rails that vanished under mud. Shays proved just as reliable in tropical heat as they had in northern snow, hauling cane and hardwood through jungle and plantation. New Zealand's bush tramways, Australia's mountain lines, and contractors building dams and tunnels in Asia all turned to the geared locomotive that American engineers once dismissed as a curiosity. Export records from Lima Locomotive Works show that Shays were shipped to every continent except Antarctica. Wherever the track was rough, the curves sharp, and the grades steep, this so-called clumsy machine became the engine of choice, solving problems that had stopped railroads cold for decades. More than a century after Ephraim Shay's first experiments in the Michigan woods, his so-called clumsy locomotives still thunder up mountain grades and around impossible curves. Out of the 2,700 Shays built by Lima, about 115 survive, preserved in museums, displayed in parks, or tucked away in the corners of old lumber towns. And remarkably, nearly 20 of them remain operational, drawing crowds to heritage railways in the Appalachians, the Rockies, and the Pacific Coast. On weekends, families line up for a ride behind a working Shay, feeling the steady thump of the cylinders and the low growl of the gears, living proof that an outsider's idea can outlast generations of conventional wisdom. Volunteers and railroad enthusiasts keep these machines alive, oiling gears, stoking fires, and passing on stories of how the Shay conquered mountains others dared not climb. Each whistle echoing through the trees is a reminder that real-world ingenuity doesn't always look elegant, but it can change the map and inspire anyone told their solution is too strange to work. Today, nearly 150 Shay locomotives still run on heritage railways, living proof that practical innovation can outlast ridicule. In a world facing complex challenges, the next breakthrough may look unconventional, even laughable at first. Progress rarely follows the rails laid by tradition. The question now is, who is willing to ignore the experts and build what others say cannot work? Share your thoughts below.